Nobody tells you the worst part of getting old. It isn't the knees, or the eyes, or the way the names of people you've known 40 years go fuzzy at the edges. The worst part is the day somebody you raised looks at you across a room and decides you're done. Decides you're a problem to be managed. Decides your whole life is just a pile of assets they're waiting on. I wore a $6 flannel shirt to that courthouse. Thrift store, church basement, the kind with a frayed cuff I'd been meaning to trim for 2 years. My son-in-law took one look at me in the hallway and turned to his lawyer and said, loud enough for the bailiff to hear, "See, he can't even dress himself anymore." And he laughed. That little snort he does. I let him laugh. I'd been letting him laugh for almost a year by then, because some things you can't argue a man out of believing. You have to let him walk all the way into the trap he built with his own hands, and then you close the door. This is the story of the morning I closed it. Welcome to Dad's harsh revenge. Settle in. Every person in these stories had 100 chances to do right and chose wrong instead, every single time, with their eyes wide open. If something here lands with you, leave a word in the comments. I read them, and if you want to ride along for the next one, you know what to do. My name's Russell. I'm 67 years old. I spent 40 of those years running a welding and fabrication shop off the state highway outside a little town in northeastern Oklahoma, the kind of place where everybody knows your truck before they know your face. I built gates and trailers and grain augers and once a spiral staircase for a doctor's wife in Tulsa that I'm still proud of. I'm not a loud man. Never have been. My late wife used to say I was the only person she'd ever met who could win an argument by saying nothing for long enough. I took that as a compliment. She didn't always mean it as one. She passed 4 years ago. Cancer, the slow kind that gives you just enough time to say everything and then takes the person you were saying it to. After 41 years of marriage, I learned to make coffee for one again. I learned the house gets a particular kind of quiet at 4 in the afternoon that no television will fix. I got through it the way I get through everything. Quietly, methodically, one morning at a time. Now here's the part that matters, and I'm going to tell it to you straight because the whole thing falls apart if you don't understand it. About 6 years back, before my wife got sick, a company came around buying mineral rights under the land my granddad homesteaded. Folks around here had been signing those leases for generations and getting next to nothing. I read the offer 3 times. Then I drove to the county seat and read about 40 years of production records on the surrounding sections. And I figured out something the company was betting I wouldn't. There was a new horizontal play coming through under our acreage. So I didn't sell. I leased, narrow and careful, with a lawyer my wife thought I was wasting good money on. 2 years later, a well came in that's still producing, and the royalty checks that started landing in my mailbox were not the kind of numbers a welder talks about at the VFW on a Friday night. I never spent it loud. That was a decision, and I made it on purpose. I kept the same truck, a '09 Ford with 300,000 miles and a tailgate that drops crooked. I kept the same house, the farmhouse my granddad raised, with the porch that needs paint and the kitchen floor that slopes toward the back door. I kept buying my shirts at the church thrift and my coffee in the big red can. The money went where money ought to go when you've got more than you'll ever use and a grandson coming up. It went into a trust. A real one, irrevocable, set up 4 years ago with a lawyer named Helen Marsh in Tulsa, who does nothing but estate and elder law and is, by my measure, the smartest person I have ever sat across a desk from. When I signed those papers, I was 63, sharp as a tack, and my own doctor wrote a letter that day saying as much, and Helen filed it away like a woman who'd seen exactly how these things end. I didn't do it because I expected trouble. I did it because my wife was gone, and I'd started to notice the way my son-in-law's questions had changed. My daughter married him 8 years ago. I'll call him what he is, my son-in-law, because he never earned more than the title. He sells commercial insurance, talks like a man who's read half a book about confidence, and he came into our family with a smile that I clocked as fake inside of 20 minutes, and spent 8 years hoping I was wrong about. He drives a leased German car he can't afford, and he's got opinions about wine. My daughter loves him, or loved the idea of him, which I've learned is a different and more dangerous thing. After my wife died, his questions got specific. How was I managing the place? Whether I'd thought about the future? Whether it might be smart to simplify? He used that word a lot, simplify. He meant sell the farm and hand him the wheel, and every time he said it, my daughter would look at her shoes and nod at me. I didn't take the bait. I just got quiet, which is what I do, and quiet to a man like him reads as weakness. He started telling himself a story, and the story was that the old man was slipping. That all that royalty money, he knew about it, you can't hide a producing well in a county this small, was just sitting there in a confused old widower's hands, waiting for somebody responsible to come take charge. The first time I heard the word guardianship, I was standing in my own kitchen. It was a Sunday, maybe 10 months ago. My daughter and my son-in-law had come for supper, which they did about once a month, mostly so he could case the place. My grandson, the only good thing that man ever helped make, was out in the barn with the cat. I'd gone to the bathroom and was coming back down the hall in my socks, quiet the way I always am, and I heard my son-in-law in the kitchen talking low. Not saying tomorrow. I'm saying we get ahead of it. There's a process. You petition the court, you get a doctor to sign off that he's not competent to manage his affairs, and the court appoints a guardian. We'd be the guardians. Then the trust, the royalties, the land, all of it runs through us, for his own protection. And my daughter, my little girl, the one I taught to drive in the church parking lot, said he'd never forgive us. And my son-in-law said, he won't know enough to be mad. That's the whole point. I stood in that dark hallway in my socks for a long time. Long enough that the floor's chill came up through and settled in my feet. Then I went back to the bathroom, ran the tap so they'd think I'd been there the whole while, and came out and asked if anybody wanted pie. I want you to understand, I didn't feel rage. I'd felt rage once, when I was younger and dumber, and it never built anything but trouble. What I felt standing in that hallway was something colder and clearer than rage. I felt the way I used to feel right before I struck an arc on a hard weld. Everything narrowing down, the world going quiet, my hands already knowing what they were going to do. The next morning I called Helen Marsh. Helen, it's Russell. I need to tell you something, and then I need you to tell me how bad it is. I laid it out. The hallway, the word guardianship, the doctor they were going to find. There was a long pause on the line, the kind Helen takes when she's already 3 moves down the board. Russell, she said, I want you to do 4 things, and I want you to do them this week. The first thing was the smartest thing she ever told me, and I'll pass it along because some old man out there might need it someday. She said, go get evaluated. Don't wait for them to pick the doctor. You go pick the best geriatric specialist in Tulsa, a board-certified one, and you sit through a full cognitive workup, the whole battery, and you let him document that you are competent. If they want to fight on the field of your mind, we show up with the field already surveyed. So I did. I drove myself to Tulsa and spent the better part of a day with a doctor who had me draw clocks and remember word lists and explain proverbs and do arithmetic backward. And at the end of it, he told me, with a little smile, that I had the cognition of a man 20 years younger, and he wished half his patients in their 40s were as sharp. He put it in writing. Helen put the writing in a folder. The second thing was the trust. She pulled the documents, confirmed it was airtight. Assets I'd legally placed in an irrevocable trust years before, while fully competent and with a doctor's letter on file from that very day, are not assets a guardian gets to touch. They're not mine to be confused about. They're the trust's. And the trust has its own ironclad terms, and the only way through that wall is to prove I was incompetent when I built it 4 years ago, which the letter on file made laughable. The third thing was harder to swallow. Helen said, from now on, when they're in your house, assume you might want a record of it. Oklahoma's a one-party consent state. You're allowed to record a conversation you're part of in your own home. I'm not telling you to set a trap. I'm telling you that if they say the kind of thing they said in that kitchen, you don't want it to be your word against theirs. I felt strange about it. Recording my own daughter in my own kitchen felt like a thing a paranoid man does. But I'd heard what I'd heard, and I'm not the kind to ignore what's right in front of me just because it's ugly. So I kept my phone in my shirt pocket on the Sundays they came, and I let it run. The fourth thing Helen said was the hardest of all. She said, don't change, don't warn them off. Don't fix the porch, or buy a new truck, or do one single thing to look like a man with money and a plan. Let them keep believing the story they've told themselves. The more sure they are, the further out on the limb they'll climb. You let them saw it off behind themselves. That's exactly what I did. For 10 months I played the part they'd cast me in. I let my son-in-law explain my own finances to me at the supper table, nodding along while he got every detail wrong. I let him help me with a phone bill I understood better than he did. When he started bringing a notepad and asking what medications I was on, I told him, slow and a little fuzzy, like a man who wasn't quite sure, and watched him write it down with a hungry little gleam. I let my daughter watch me forget where I'd set my keys, twice, on purpose, the keys sitting right there on the hook the whole time. I am not proud of how good I got at it, but I'd heard her say he'd never know enough to be mad, and a part of me wanted to find out just how far they'd go. They went all the way. The papers came on a Tuesday in March. A process server, polite kid, handed me an envelope on my own porch. A petition for the appointment of a guardian of the person and estate of Russell. Me, filed in the district court, county probate division. The petitioners were my daughter and my son-in-law. The grounds were that I was an incapacitated person, unable to manage my financial resources or meet essential requirements for my physical health and safety, and at risk of financial exploitation, and that immediate appointment of a guardian was in my best interest. Attached was a physician's affidavit. A doctor I had never met in my life swore under his signature that based on his evaluation, I showed significant cognitive decline, consistent with progressive dementia, and lacked the capacity to manage my affairs. I read that part twice. He found a doctor, I said. He found a doctor who signed something, Helen said, and there was a flatness in her voice I'd never heard. There's a difference. When did this physician examine you, Russell? He didn't. I've never been in a room with the man. The line went quiet. Then Helen said very softly, Russell, I want you to listen to me carefully. If a physician signed a sworn affidavit attesting to an examination and findings that never happened, that is not a strong case against you. That is a crime, and it is going to belong to whoever procured it. Do not say a word to anyone. The hearing is set for the 28th. Be there 40 minutes early, in whatever you'd normally wear. We are going to let them go first. The night before, I laid that $6 flannel out flat on the bed the way I'd seen my wife lay out my clothes for 40 years. I pressed it once with my hand. White-checked, soft from 100 washings, a stranger's shirt I'd made my own. I thought about all the ways a man my age is supposed to be afraid of a room where strangers decide whether he gets to run his own life. And I wasn't. I slept like a stone. You sleep good when you've got nothing to hide and everything ready. The county courthouse is a squat brick building from the 30s, with a flag out front and steps worn into smooth dips by 90 years of boots. I got there early, like Helen said, and I took a seat in the courtroom before anyone else came in. There's an old trick to that. When you're already settled and still by the time the other side walks in, they have to do the entering, the searching, the reading of your face, and you give them nothing back. Let them perform. Let them spend their first 30 seconds rattled by how calm you are. My son-in-law came in like he owned the deed to the building. Pressed suit, the kind of shoes that cost more than my monthly grocery bill, a tie the color of a bruise. His lawyer was a smooth article named Garrett Sloan, the sort who advertises on the back of the phone book, and talks to a courtroom like it's a stage, and he's the only one who knows his lines. My daughter trailed behind them in a gray dress, hair done, mouth set tight. She wouldn't look at me. That told me everything I needed to know about where her head was. My son-in-law looked at my thrift store flannel, and then leaned and said something low to his lawyer, and they both let their mouths curl. I caught it. I let them have it. I had one thin manila folder on the table in front of me, the cheap kind that comes 10 to a pack. They had an accordion file thick as a Bible. He glanced at my little folder and actually smiled, and I thought, smile all you want. The curtain hasn't gone up yet. The judge came in. Patricia Vance, a woman in her late 50s with reading glasses on a chain, and the unhurried calm of somebody who has watched families do terrible things to each other for 30 years and never once let it rush her. She got herself settled, looked over the both of us, and said, "We're here on the petition for guardianship in the matter of Russell. Petitioners may proceed." Garrett Sloan stood up like he'd been rehearsing in the mirror, and I'll give the man this much. He was slick. He walked the judge through it smooth as oil. A devoted daughter and son-in-law, heartbroken, forced to act. A vulnerable widower living alone in a deteriorating farmhouse. A man who couldn't keep his medication straight, who lost his keys, who let strangers, he actually said strangers, manage his affairs. He held up that physician's affidavit like it was scripture and read the worst lines out loud. Progressive cognitive decline, lacks capacity, at serious risk of financial exploitation. My daughter dabbed at her eyes. My son-in-law sat there nodding with the grave, responsible face of a man performing concern. And Sloan built it up to his big finish, half turning toward me so the judge would have to look at me too. "Your Honor," he said, "this is a man who came to court today, to a hearing about his own competence. In a worn-out shirt he bought second-hand for a few dollars, while sitting on mineral assets worth a fortune that he is plainly incapable of protecting. My clients aren't here for themselves. They're here because somebody has to be the adult in this family. He sat down, smoothed that bruise-colored tie. My daughter exhaled. The handful of people in the gallery murmured. Judge Vance looked at me over her glasses for a long moment. She had the eyes of someone who'd already noticed a thing or two Sloane hadn't. Sir, she said, before we continue, I'm going to ask you a few questions directly. Can you tell me today's date, the name of this county, and who the current president is? This was the moment they'd built the whole thing on. The moment the confused old man fumbles and proves their case for them. I saw my son-in-law lean forward an inch, hungry for it. I answered her. The date clean, the county clean, the president clean. And then I kept going, calm and even, the way you talk when you've waited 10 months to talk. Your Honor, since we're on the subject of what I do and don't understand, I'd like to tell you the exact terms of the irrevocable trust I established 4 years ago, the name and address of the geriatric specialist who evaluated me 2 weeks ago, the production figures on the well in question for the last 3 quarters, and the precise reason my son-in-law believes I'm confused, which is that I let him believe it. On purpose. For 10 months. The room didn't gasp. It went still. That particular stillness that drops over a place when something has just turned, and only a couple of people in it understand exactly what. Judge Vance's pen stopped moving. Mr. Sloane, she said slowly, not taking her eyes off me, your client's petition rests on a physician's affidavit. I'd like to hear from the respondent's counsel about that affidavit. Helen Marsh stood. She's a small woman, neat, and she's got a way of talking that makes a loud man's voice sound like a child throwing a tantrum. She didn't raise hers at all. Your Honor, I direct the court to the affidavit's own language. Doctor, the petitioner's physician, swears he performed an evaluation and reached a diagnosis. I'd ask that we establish, for the record, the date and location of that examination. The judge looked at Sloane. Sloane looked at his client. My son-in-law's mouth opened and didn't quite shut. Your Honor, Helen continued, my client has never met that physician, has never been examined in a room with him. We have his calendar, his phone records, and his own sworn statement to that effect. The examination described in that affidavit did not occur. You could have heard a pin drop on carpet. Furthermore, Helen said, and now she opened a folder of her own, thicker than mine, the respondent was in fact evaluated 2 weeks ago by a board-certified geriatric psychiatrist in Tulsa, through a full neurocognitive workup. His report is filed with the court this morning. His finding is that my client has the cognitive function of a man in his mid-40s and shows no indication whatsoever of impairment. I have the report, the testing data, and the doctor available by telephone if the court wishes. Garrett Sloane stood up fast. Your Honor, we'd want a review. Sit down, Mr. Sloane. Judge Vance didn't say it sharp. She said it tired, which was worse. She was reading the geriatric report now, turning pages, and her face was the face of a judge watching a petition die on her desk in real time. Then I opened my little 10-cent folder. I want you to understand what was in it, because it wasn't much by weight. But it had taken 10 months and 4 years to fill. The trust documents, first. The whole legal architecture, set up 4 years prior with my own doctor's competency letter dated the same day, signed and notarized and filed, the assets sitting safe and untouchable behind it. I laid it down. The geriatric report, the real one, in full. I laid it down. And then the last thing. I slid it across slow, no drama, just paper. A transcript. A clean, dated, certified transcript of a recording made in my own kitchen, in a one-party consent state, where I was a party to the conversation, and the law was on my side. My son-in-law's voice, clear as a bell, telling my daughter there was a process, that you get a doctor to sign off, that he won't know enough to be mad, that's the whole point. And a second one, from a month later, where he told her not to worry about whether the doctor had actually seen me, because Garrett would handle the paperwork, and nobody checks. Nobody checks. Garrett Sloane read that line and went the color of old ash. Your Honor, Helen said into the silence, we've filed a formal complaint with the Oklahoma Bar Association against opposing counsel, and a report with Adult Protective Services and the District Attorney's Office, alleging a fraudulent affidavit and an attempt at financial exploitation of an elder. Both were filed 3 days ago. Certified receipts are the last pages of the respondent's submission. And right then, on schedule, the doors at the back of the courtroom opened. A woman in a plain navy jacket came in, unhurried, the kind of calm that comes from doing a hard job so long it stopped being personal. She had a badge clipped to her belt and a folder under her arm. She walked up the aisle and handed something to the bailiff, who handed it to the judge, and she took a seat in the front row of the gallery like a woman who intended to stay a while. The investigator from the elder abuse unit. Helen had told her exactly when to come. My son-in-law turned to look at her, then turned to his lawyer, then turned to my daughter, and in that one little circuit of his eyes I watched the whole thing he'd built come apart at every seam at once. My daughter grabbed his sleeve. I heard her whisper it. "Why is she here? What is happening?" He didn't answer her. "The doctor," she said louder now, that tight thread of panic coming into it. "The affidavit. You said he examined Daddy. You told me he examined him." He still didn't answer her. And in that silence, sitting there in her gray dress, with the courtroom watching, my daughter finally understood. I watched it land on her the way I'd watched understanding land on her face her whole life, since she was a little girl figuring out a hard thing. She understood that the man she'd trusted with everything, the man she'd chosen to believe over her own father, had handed her a story and never told her it was a lie. That he'd used her grief and her worry about me to build something criminal, and signed her name to it right alongside his. "You forged it," she said, "not a question. There was no exam. Her voice broke clean in half. You made me part of this." Judge Vance had seen enough. She took off her reading glasses and folded her hands and looked out at that table with the weight of 30 years behind her. "This petition is denied," she said. "I find no credible evidence of incapacity. To the contrary, I find a respondent who is fully competent and who has been, frankly, more careful and clear-headed than most of the people who appear before me." She let that sit. "I'm referring the physician's affidavit and the conduct of petitioner's counsel to the district attorney and to the bar. Mr. Sloan, you are not to leave the state without notifying this court." Her eyes moved to my son-in-law, and they were not angry. They were something worse than angry. They were the eyes of a woman who'd watched people throw away everything good in their lives for 30 years, and still couldn't get used to the waste of it. "And to the petitioner who organized this," she said, "I'd suggest you use the drive home to think about what you've cost yourself today. You came into my courtroom to take a man's freedom because you thought he was too dim to stop you. I hope you understand now how badly you misjudged who you were sitting across from." The gavel came down once, clean, like a period at the end of a long, ugly sentence. My son-in-law gathered his papers with hands that wouldn't hold still. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at his wife. He picked up that thick accordion file and walked out of the courtroom without a word to anybody, and the navy-jacketed woman from the elder abuse unit got up, calm as ever, and followed him out into the hall. My daughter stayed in her chair. The dun hair, the gray dress, the whole careful armor she'd walked in wearing. It was all just gone, and what was left was a woman sitting alone in a room where every single thing had gone wrong at once. She was crying. Not the dabbing kind from before. The real kind, the kind that comes when the story you told yourself for a year collapses in 45 minutes and you have to sit in the wreck of it with people watching. She turned to me, "Daddy." Her voice came apart on the one word. "I didn't know. Not the doctor. I swear to God I didn't know he did that. Please." I stood up. I looked at her a long time. "I told you I felt no rage in that hallway 10 months ago, and that was true, and it was still true standing there. What I felt looking at my daughter was something heavier and quieter than rage. It was grief. The particular grief of a man looking at someone he loves and understanding, all the way down, that something between you is broken and can't go back to what it was. Not because of one thing she did, but because of who she let herself become while she was doing it. But she's my girl. And there was a 16-year-old boy out in the world who was about to find out his father was in serious trouble, and that boy was going to need at least one parent who hadn't lost herself completely. "Go home," I said, quiet. "Take care of my grandson. Be the woman he thinks you are, even if you stopped being her for a while. That's the only thing I want from you." She tried to say something else and couldn't. I turned and walked out. The afternoon sun hit those worn courthouse steps the way Oklahoma sun does in March, thin and bright and not caring one bit about anything that had just happened inside. Somewhere a truck rattled by on the square, somebody's radio. A normal day that had no idea it had just been the most important morning of my life. My grandson was sitting at the bottom of the steps. 16, all elbows, his backpack hanging off one shoulder the way they wear them at that age, like the strap is a suggestion. He'd insisted on coming. I'd told him to stay home, and he'd looked at me with my late wife's stubborn chin and said no, and I hadn't had the heart to fight him. He stood up when he saw me, scanning my face the way he's done his whole life, because that kid misses nothing, never has. Grandpa, he said, did you win? I came down the steps and put my arm around his shoulders. He's nearly tall enough now that I have to reach up to do it. I didn't go in there to win, son, he frowned. Then what'd you go in there for? To make sure nobody could take my life out of my hands while I was still standing here living it. He thought about that. Did that thing he does where you can see the gears turning, where it's really going in and not just bouncing off. What about Mom? I let out a long breath. Your mom made some bad choices because she trusted the wrong person. She's going to have a hard road for a while. She's going to need you to be steady. Think you can do that? He nodded, slow. Didn't fully understand it yet. That was all right. He had time. And now, so did I. We walked across the square to my crooked old Ford. No fancy car waiting, no big speech, nothing for anybody else to see. Just a grandfather and his grandson and an Oklahoma afternoon and 10 months of patience finally completely paid off. I've still got that flannel shirt. It's folded on the top shelf of my closet next to a hat of my wife's I can't throw away. I didn't keep it as a trophy. I'm not built that way. Trophies are for men who need reminding they once mattered. I kept it for a different reason. To remember that the cheapest thing in a room is sometimes worn by the only person in it who has nothing to prove. That living small when you could live large isn't weakness. It's the surest sign of a man who already has everything he needs. And that the most dangerous person in any courtroom, any family, any quiet country kitchen is not the loudest one, or the best dressed one, or the one with the 4-inch folder and the bruise-colored tie. It's the old man in the second-hand shirt who got there early, sat down, folded his hands, and hasn't said a word yet. My son-in-law thought he was managing a confused widower. He spent 10 months sawing through a limb with both of us sitting on it, and he never once looked down to see which side of the cut he was on. So if you're out there right now being underestimated, written off because of your age, your clothes, your truck, the quiet way you carry yourself, let me tell you what 40 years of welding and one bad March taught me. Quiet is not empty. Simple is not weak. And the man who arrives early sits down still and lets the loud ones talk themselves all the way out onto the end of the branch. He already knows how the story ends. He's just waiting on everybody else to catch up. If this one stayed with you, leave a word below and tell me where you're listening from. I do read them. And come on back for the next one. Thanks for sitting with me a while.